the Knight Foundation Forum, what would be the 1-2 core messages that you think can summarize all the valuable conversations that took place?
At the forum?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of them is certainly about business sustainability, that it's interesting that despite how much money the foundation puts into journalism, not a lot of it goes to hiring actual newsroom staff. The goal here is really to say, how do we build a business here? How do we help you grow audience? How do we help you save money by using smarter technology? And like, how do you build it? How can we help you figure out how you can make more money and spend less money? And so we really try to focus on the business sustainability, because some funders like find a pet project and we'll just fund it completely for 10 years and say, like, this is something that we know will never make any money and we will just continue to fund it 100% of operations. Knight isn't really that. Knight's attitude is we would like to be an early investor in things but encourage those things to grow and become sustainable so they can pay for themselves, so that we're not continuing to put money in 10 years, because what we want to do in year 2 is find 10 other things that we can put money against and grow as many different things as we can. So if our money ends up being connected to the same 10 grantees every year, we're just limiting how much impact we can have. So business sustainability is a big part of it.
But I will add, because we are a recipient and a very grateful one at that, there's a difference between being a sponsor and being a partner. Being a sponsor, you do look to, and being a partner means that you have a symbiotic benefit. And that's what we want to do with our partners. We want to make sure that it's more of a, it's more of a long-term relationship, because it has that added advantage to being beneficial to both parties.
Yeah, and because we do sponsorships year after year for the same organizations. That's a different model, but we're doing a straight up grant. The idea here is we help you be successful in 5 years, and in some ways we view the success of our grants as us not being as involved in them in 5 years, because they've been able to be sustainable without us.
Right.
So sustainability is certainly a big focus of ours, and I think the other focus of so we had one of our sessions was with 3 people doing very, very different business models. One was a Salt Lake Tribune, which has went from being a for-profit to a nonprofit, which is not nearly as easy as, not that it even sounds easy, but it's a lot harder than even it sounds to do that. They've done it successfully and are now profitable after many years of losing money. We had Capital B, which is a brand new site for covering Black America that has local bureaus. The first one in Atlanta. They're trying a model that's really based on membership and affinity. It's like, you like what we do, so you pay. You get not even a subscription, like you're not paying for access. You're just, it's like more like the NPR model. You really like us, so we're just going to give you $1,000 and you can do with it whatever you want. They're building a membership model out and had very early success with it. And then the third guy we had on was this guy named Jay Allred, who runs this thing called the Richland Source in Ohio. And he's like been the guy in this business who's tried to figure out how to make money every way possible. Like they printed up 3,000 popcorn bags and put their branding on it and gave them to every high school so they could hand them out at football games. And so here's the Richland Source suddenly in every high school in the area. He's got his own, they do a concert series, a branded concert series. They bring local bands in and do the Richland Source concert series. So they produce journalism all day long, but they have all these other ways of making money that are not traditional journalism ways. So there's a lot of people trying a lot of different things in the business to figure out what model works. And the bad news is there isn't one model anymore like advertising used to be, but the good news is there's a lot of other ones popping up, and it's a lot easier for a local site now to say which of these fits us best, as opposed to having to accept advertising. And the big problem with advertising is always been this in a digital world. You got paid more money on an ad model if you got more page views, right? So the more audience you got, the more money you made. And that sounds great, except we all know what gets the most audience in the internet. It's not coverage of the school board hearing, or, it's like, oh, here's here's a photo gallery of the Kardashians. That'll get 10 million page views and it'll make you lots of money, but it doesn't move the local journalism message forward an inch. So people got the wrong incentives were applied, and people started doing a lot of crappy journalism because they thought it would get more page views. So what's nice, as tough as it's been for the journalism world, that the model is the model is falling apart, is that now when you get money as a member, if you give money to an organization because you like what they do, and somebody gives you $1,000, everybody's happy. The newsroom's happy because they earned that member by doing good journalism. The business side's happy because they got another $1,000, and everybody's in sync on the proper way to make money, where the advertising, it just wasn't synced up. We were just incented by the wrong things, and we did a lot of bad things. And so now we're not driven by page views anymore. And it's a nice thing when you get out into the world now and realize that people aren't asking about page views.
But Jim,
they're asking about impact, they're asking about members. Yeah.
would you say that that was journalism more what you're referring to as entertainment? And my question is, have you ever thought of bringing your recipients together and having best practices shared or models expanded that way?
Yeah, we've done, not since I've been here, because I've only been here 6 months, but we do grantee meetings. We did one in right before the pandemic, I think, actually. We invite all of our grantees someplace and basically sit and have conversations. So we do definitely try to tap into the network. I think we're trying to do that even more now, which is, journalism is, it's another thing. It's sort of one of my pet theories, but I really do think journalism is in what I call the huddling for warmth phase right now, which is you're going to work together to figure out how to solve these problems, or we're not going to solve them. And if you want to be that one site that thinks they're smarter than everybody else and wants to wander off into the blizzard on your own, good luck. Like maybe you get out, but you might not. And why wouldn't you want to share that information with somebody else? I mean, competition in journalism is really, once you get below the national level, there isn't that much of it anymore. And we don't have towns with 3 newspapers anymore. There's competition still, obviously, but it's not as fierce as it once was. And people are much more willing to work with each other and share good ideas.
Yeah, I see already we've started the conversation. We're going to have a lot of questions to ask Jim. Brady, thank you for being with us here today. First of all, we see in your bio that very fairly you define yourself, and that's the truth, as a digital media innovator. What it takes today for media organization, journalism organization to become innovators in this changing digital environment. Can you give us a little bit of a sense, and we will also follow up with a lot of questions. So starting with that.
Sure. I mean, the obvious answer is, one of journalism's problems has always been, one of the things you used to hear early in my career was like, most people are like, we're happy to be fast followers, right? That was always the answer, which is, we'll be the second one. Once somebody does something really cool, we'll be right behind them to do it. But the problem with that is there weren't that many people willing to go out, do it first. So like, you can't be a fast follower until somebody does it. And there was this caution. Everybody was terrified that they were going to screw. There's a real fear of failure in journalism and early on. And I think the key to digital for me was I was always like, I'm happy to fail first. I'm happy to gain. I might try 3 things and 2 of them won't work, but 1 of them will. And I was always happy to take the risk of having something crash and burn in front of the public's eyes. I think some people are not so willing to do that, and they only want to do things they're sure are going to work. And when you're dealing with the digital world where everything's changing so quickly, there is no thing that's definitely going to work. If there anything out there that was definitely going to work, it would have been done already. So the idea is like, you just have to be willing to take some chances. And I'll give you a great example. This is what I learned during my time when I was ESPN's public editor. So ESPN got roundly mocked, I would say in 2006, 2007, I think. They did this thing called the ESPN phone. It was basically a phone that had ESPN branding on it. Like you could walk out like and they did it. They was around for like a year. They got roundly mocked for it, and they stopped producing it, right? So everybody talks about what a laughable failure the ESPN phone was. But 2 years later, when it came time to actually start building mobile applications, guess who knew a whole lot about how to do it? ESPN, because ESPN had already built things for mobile. Even if the first one failed, when they had to line up to do mobile again in 2009, they were way ahead of everybody else because they'd been playing around in that space for a couple of years already. So then they put their apps out and they put out their mobile sites, and people like, God, ESPN has a great mobile, has a great mobile app. Well, and it's so smart. Well, it wasn't smart by accident. It was smart because they failed doing the ESPN phone, but they learned enough about how people used mobile and what worked and what didn't, that when they actually had to build something that was really, frankly, a much bigger product, they were ready. So the key is, be willing to take chances. Don't assume that because something failed, there aren't pieces of that failure that you can use in later projects. So, but you just have to have and a lot of it is just the stomach to fail. And that requires you to be inside an organization that really that allows you to do that, right? When I got to WashingtonPost.com, I got asked if I wanted to apply for the job to run the website in 2004. And I was up against a whole bunch of people who had been working at the newspaper for a while. I had been gone for a couple of years. I'd been at the paper as a youngster. I'd left to go to AOL. And AOL, back when I worked at AOL so long ago, it was cool. Most of you weren't even alive. I don't think AOL has been cool since you've been alive. But there was a time when it was the biggest of everything. It had the biggest sports site, the biggest news site, the biggest everything. And I was there during that time, so I'd left. And when I went to come back, I just was like, I'm looking at these other people I'm up against for the job. I'm not going to beat any of them on journalism resume because they were all far more experienced. But my attitude was, I am going to write a memo that says, if you give me this job, I'm blowing this website up because it's got to start stepping up and matching the moment. It's still putting the newspaper online and not doing much else. We're not doing much with video. We're not doing much with interactivity. And the memo was basically, absolutely, I'll blow this place up. And I got the job. And it was partially because Don Graham, who was the publisher of the Post at the time, Don was like, I love this. This is exactly what I need. I need somebody to come in here and blow this up. And so I knew two things. One, and later on, I think somebody asked me like, why write that memo? Because I mean, they easily could have read that and been like, you could have been on the discard pile right away if that wasn't what they were looking for. My attitude was, if that wasn't what they were looking for, I didn't want the job because I wouldn't be able to innovate if I was in a place that was only looking for incremental change. So, but the minute I got that job, I basically had a green light to try anything, and I did. And so it's easy for me to say, just go and take chances and don't be afraid to fail. You do have to have the support system above you to support you if some of those things go wrong, because they will. But I think a lot of it is you have to start with the idea that you're willing to go out, you're willing to put yourself out there and fail and have something go wrong. And it hasn't hurt. It certainly hasn't hurt me in my career. I got plenty of things I could point to and say, well, that didn't work. But I think over time, you just get respect as somebody who's always willing to push the edges a little bit. And once people put you in the category of someone who's always pushing the edges, they're willing to accept some level of failure because they understand it's hard to do new things, and a lot of them aren't going to work. So
what do you think is the major element that is missing right now from media organizations? The major element in terms of business sustainability and at the same time of content related to.
I think the biggest problem is still, and it's getting better, but the biggest problem is still not being particularly engaged with our audiences. Like, I mean, engaged like directly, not here's a comment board, go write some terrible comment that no one will ever read. I mean, like really engaging the reader in a way that gets them involved in things. Because I will speak for newspapers specifically. Newspapers had such a good business for such a long time that they didn't have to worry about really talking to the consumer ever. Like it was sort of like, oh, fine, you canceled your subscription. There's a million more of you, so who cares, right? We didn't really treat them like with much respect because we got all of our money from advertising and 10% from subscriptions. So why should we spend a lot of time dealing with the masses when our money all comes from auto dealers and banks, et cetera? And I think when the world flipped and a lot of websites are now dependent on subscriptions, membership, events, like you better have a relationship with that audience. You can't get people to show up at things if they don't care about what you do. You know, I started a site in Philadelphia in 2014 called Billy Penn, and it was basically a startup that was going after a younger audience that the Philadelphia Inquirer wasn't going after. And I remember going into a bar in Philly when I was up there visiting, waiting for a friend, and I was talking to the bartender, and she was asking about what I was doing in town. I said, I have a website here. What website? Billy Penn. And she slammed her hand down on the table and she said, I effing love Billy Penn. Effing love it. And it's like, you don't hear people talk about newspapers like that, right? But why did they love us? Because we threw events and we had fun events and people would show up at those events and they would meet our reporters and they would feel like they were part of a community. They felt like they knew us, right? They don't know the Inquirer's reporters. They never met any of the Inquirer's reporters. The Inquirer is just this thing that shows up on their doorstep with names at the tops of stories that they couldn't identify in a lineup. But we were actually like putting reporters in these events, and we wrote with a voice that read like people would talk, and we had a much more looser voice. We covered things they really cared about. And so I think the newspapers have to get back to this idea that you got to get the consumers to care about what you do, and we can't talk past them. I think I always say about newspapers, when they were really going strong, they always wanted to be of the people. They just didn't really want to be with them. You know, it was just like, we want to represent you, but we don't want to have to actually really engage with you. And that's got to change, because people only have so many dollars they're willing to spend on media, or really on anything in terms of subscriptions. And you got to earn your way onto that list. And maybe if you're the New York Times or the Washington Post, you're just big and good enough that you can do that. But most local papers can't earn their way into your life like that unless they reach out and they cover things you care about. And the other thing I'd say is television, though, has a little bit of an advantage now that I think's underappreciated, and that local television stations, while the journalism isn't nearly as good as in any newspaper you'll see, although it's getting closer now because a lot of TV stations are hiring old newspaper, or like hiring away from newspapers to produce the websites. But the one thing they did always have was the things that print people used to make fun of them for, like 7 on your side, we're here for you, all that very hokey kind of consumer focused stuff that we all laughed at. Well, they were ahead of the game on that one. They were actually, you know, they would go out and spend 2 hours trying to get the local power company to repay some guy $800 who got screwed on a bill. And that people see that, they think the TV station folks are there backing them up. So they have some advantages still, and the business is better, but also that reconnecting with the audience is not something they have to do. They never really lost that connection because the broadcast piece focused a lot on helping consumers. So I mean, I think that's the big gap. The big gap is, if you treat consumers like they're fungible, they will return the favor and they'll treat you the same way.
Yeah. If you were in a position today on behalf of a media organization to hire journalists for different positions on the digital website, what would be the major qualifications you would be looking for, except for the excellence of the reporting?
Yeah, putting that aside, assuming that to start, I mean, certainly being able to write with some panache, with some voice, and I don't mean voice like opinion. I think people hear voice and they think that automatically means opinion. You can write creatively and with wit and humor without being a partisan. So it's knowing how to communicate online. It's a different kind of style. And to be honest, the second thing I'd look for is an immense amount of patience, because working in the digital space, you are going to lose your mind every once in a while. It's something somebody sends you, and you have to, you do not help your organization when you respond to it in a nasty, terrible way, right? You might be thinking, I'm only answering for me, but you're really not.
Yeah.
And, you know, every newsroom deals with this. Like, if you looked at what happened with the Washington Post with Felicia Sanmez and that whole mess from about a year ago, is Felicia tweeted something out about Kobe Bryant after the plane crash where he died. Talking about the rape charge that he was acquitted of, but and I think the issue at the Post, and I'm not taking the side on this one, I'm just explaining the problem. The problem, I think, with the Post management was, we have a whole bunch of reporters who spent, all day working on this very nuanced Kobe Bryant obituary that mentions the rape charge. And yes, we're going to get more into that as this coverage evolves over the next couple of days, but all the effort that was put into that has now been overridden by this social media fury that has burst out because you decided you had to post something on top of these reporters' work. And if somebody from the sports department had taken one of your stories and tweeted something about it that was sort of firebrand, you wouldn't be too happy to have your story get lost in the shuffle of this firestorm that you created. Again, a lot of people will take Felicia's side on that. A lot will take the Post side on it. But the point is, it's a problem either way. Is like when you have 1,000 people out there who all represent the Washington Post, any one of them can tweet something on a given day that, partisans can decide to grab and say, see, this is what the Washington Post is.
Yeah.
It's like, no, that's one person out of 1,000 who tweeted this thing. The other 999 didn't do anything about that. So it's really, you do have to have, I do think it's an important thing to interview for, which is really try to test someone. And you don't really want the hair trigger temper person running your social media account. Let's put it that way. You get yourself in a lot of trouble. So some of it is just having the stomach to kind of understand you're going to be dealing in some unpleasant things, and you gotta stiff upper lip it sometimes, because you can do a lot of damage to the organization if you don't. So, but it's starting with the idea that the reporting is, I think it's writing and it's patience, and it's honestly humor, because that works really well on social. If you can be funny without being snarky, overly snarky, I think that's very appealing.
Yeah, I would like to give the stage to our attendees, those who are on camera or off camera. And let's start from the foreign journalist who is now in LA, Edis Jansen. How are you? We don't hear you, but we can hear you if you unmute yourself.
Oh, you can.
Yeah. Do you want to ask a question to Jim directly? Because I know that you've been attending the program and you know that we know that you are one of the foreign journalists who are really interested on how to make also journalism sustainable.
For sure. I kind of joined a little later to the session, so I was still trying to gather what some of our main items is. And this is one of my first events, but I'll just ask something that I'm generally
Yes.
curious about. It's kind of similar to the question that you asked earlier, but for me, one of the things I work specifically for TV and mostly for international news channels, and I wondered if you have any take on the sort of the TV industry and how it's evolved here in the US when you look at the national media, the American televisions, basically. How do you see it going forward, and how do you sort of compare it to some of these international outlets?
Well, the second part's harder because I don't know that I'm as familiar with all the international outlets as I could be. But I think if you're talking about the cable sort of network level, not the local, right? You're talking about national.
Correct. Yeah. I mean.
Yeah. I mean, I think
some of the differences between the local and national were a lot more obvious than the national versus international. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the national has been a real challenge. I think the surveys are pretty clear about where, trust in media in this country is at one of its lowest points in history, or at least since Gallup has been tracking it in the last 30 or 40 years. Honestly, I think cable TV has a lot to do with that. In the sense that, it's ratings are driven. I mean, ratings are driven by having things on that are divisive in a lot of cases. And so when Trump was in office, everything was about Trump for 4 years. And now everything becomes about, whatever the topic of the day is, but it's not particularly nuanced. It's not particularly local. And they've gone to the programming route now of having people yell at each other for 15 minutes every hour who, when the session starts, are never going to get any closer on the issue. Like, I could live with people debating if you felt like at the end of the 15 minutes, anybody had moved an inch on the topic. But when the session starts or when the segment starts, they're not going to move an inch. It's just who's going to scream what talking points at who. What I think is fascinating to watch is what's happened in the last week, where all of a sudden you see cable news at its best, right? They're on the ground in Ukraine, doing really interesting work, walking around, talking to people, doing the actual reporting that CNN became famous for in the Gulf War. They're kind of showing like what can happen when you really put your effort towards something that's more of a noble story than who's gonna pack the Supreme Court or who's gonna do this. So I mean, I do hope that there's a lesson taken out of all this, and I think you see with CNN right now, if you've been reading about Chris Licht's appointment there and his real push to go back to the center to say, look, we have to get away from what we've been doing for the last 4 years, which is going hard left. And we need to go back to the middle because that's what CNN always occupied, was that space. Fox was always going to be on the right. MSNBC was always going to be on the left. And CNN was kind of the one that was viewed as the most centrist. And then they kind of went hard left in the last 4 years. And it hasn't helped their ratings. On top of that, their ratings have gone kind of south in that. So I'm hoping that there's some correction coming. Look, if there's going to be a Fox on the right and an MSNBC on the left, that's just something we'll all deal with. But it would be nice if there was some cable station that would go back to some of the stuff that CNN did in the 80s, 90s, and aughts. And you're seeing it with the Ukraine. Whether it's sustainable, I don't know. But I think it's been a real challenge. And I would say I would connect it to local in one way. If you go back 10 years ago, if you watched Fox and MSNBC and CNN, they actually used to do a lot of segments where they would pull an interesting story out of a local paper somewhere and do a 2-minute segment on it. Really interesting story in the LA Times. Let's go do a quick 2-minute hit on it. Like, I do think part of the solution of the national problem is better local journalism, because we'll give the opportunity for the networks to do more stories off things happening at the local level. Right now, there's enough reporting going on at the local level for there to be enough of those opportunities. So, but I just hope we get away from the debating part, because I mean, that to me is just, I don't know why I want to watch two people debate a topic where I know neither of them are going to do anything differently after this thing's over. It's just a waste of my time, and it fires me up. It makes me mad. and it makes me angry. And I'm like, why am I watching this? This is like, that term on Twitter, the doom scrolling, just like reading all these terrible things on Twitter and just doing it for an hour for some reason. I feel that way when I watch cable sometimes. I just wonder why I just decided to spend an hour watching a bunch of people, spit fire at each other. So I hope that changes, because I do think that's done. If you look at the trust numbers, I'll give you another example. If you look at the trust numbers, it kind of follows this. There's kind of an old, not a cliche because it's true, but in the US, if you look at the numbers of trust of Congress, right? Nobody trusts Congress, but most people like their congressman, right? When it gets to the local level, people tend to be okay with their guy. They just don't like the body. The media is a little bit like that right now. If you look at the numbers, the trust numbers are totally different for local than they are for national, and they get kind of caught up in that number. Like nobody trusts the media. Well, if you break the numbers down, the trust in national media is tiny. The trust in local media ain't great, but it's about 20% higher. So I do think at a local level, we don't have the same problem at the national and local level. The trust problem is really a national problem. I'm not saying local doesn't have a trust problem, but it's not nearly as stark. So I do think, what local hasn't done to this point is they haven't emulated the national model. Local TV, I mean, thank God. But I also think there's some reality. This is a sustainability challenge too, because if you're CNN and you look at a population of 320 million people in the US, you can probably afford to alienate half of them by being ideological. If you can turn some percentage of that 160 million into addicts, you can be successful. The numbers are big enough. But if you're in San Antonio, Texas, you can't alienate half of 4 million people by going hard ideologically. So I think you look at the TV stations and the newspapers there, they work really hard to make sure they maintain that sort of more objective journalism, because frankly, the business wouldn't support going too hard one way. You can't afford to lose half your potential audience by going too ideological. So that's been an interesting thing to watch there. And so I think the national TV is the biggest problem we have in media right now. I think they could do great. They could do amazing good. And like I said, you're seeing the last 6 days. But I do worry what happens when this particular crisis passes and there's not another crisis to fill it. Are we going to go back to 8 hours a day if Donald Trump's going to run for president, or 8 hours a day of why AOC is such a nightmare, or 8 hours a day of why Ted Cruz is a nightmare? Because I have no interest in that. And I think a lot of people have tuned out of that based on the ratings of all of the 3K big cable networks right now. So I'm hoping there's a remaking of things there, but I don't know if it'll happen. I don't know. Maybe just be too good business to the incentive isn't there yet. And maybe this war will, if it's the only thing it does that's positive, maybe it will remind people that what cable TV can be really great at is coverage of these kind of global crisis points that.
If I can ask a question, Jim, we've seen a great shift on the support of the local news industry. Can you give us a little bit of the rationale why and how the local news industry can play a role of bringing real news on the local community's issues and dealing with the reporting on those issues? And the question is also why do you think that the local news industry is needing a great support right now, and what is the outcome out of the expectation from the local news industry?
Well, the crisis right now is because we were all too slow to adapt. Some of us. It's funny, when I got into digital in 1995. I got into it in 95, which is basically when digital started, right? So I've been doing this as long as there's been digital journalism. I've been in digital journalism. And 10 years, 20 years later, people would say, how did you see this coming? And my response was always, how did you not? I don't think it was any brilliant thing that I saw it coming. It just seems to me like, wait, the consumer is going to get to pick what they want, when they want it. They can read whatever story they want on any site. They can watch, when you give them it's like giving somebody the remote control. They're just going to start watching whatever the hell they want, flipping around the dial, because you've given them the control to dictate what it is they see. So I never was a mystery to me that digital was going to be big. And it was never really a mystery to me that it had to be different than the core publication. If you were the Washington Post starting a website, you couldn't just make the newspaper. And if you were a television station, you just couldn't recreate TV. But we did do that. And despite the arguments of some of us early on, this has to be more different than it is. It wasn't. And because of that, we didn't try to develop new business models. We put it all on advertising, which was always a gamble in an ecosystem where any player could come in at any time and eat that market. And we've seen that now with Facebook and Google and Amazon. So, I mean, we were just slow out of the gate. And I would say the other problem we had was that we didn't really have the right people running these organizations to make that kind of shift. We didn't have people running newspapers in the US who were kind of used to moving on a dime, moving quickly and remaking they had been running a very consistent, profitable business for 20, 30 years. And all of a sudden everything gets upset. They were not the people to make that immediate change because it just wasn't in their DNA. So I think that was a problem. So we're in this problem now because the revenue isn't there and we didn't develop enough new revenue streams to make up for what we lost. I think the answer as to why it's important is just, it's the functioning of democracy. If you've heard it and I know you're in LA, so I don't know how long you've been there, but there was a famous story the LA Times did 5 or 6 years ago that won a Pulitzer Prize about a town in California named Bell. But there were basically a bunch of, nobody was covering the city of Bell. And because of that, the city council kept giving themselves really, really big raises to the point where the city manager of Bell, not a particularly large city, was making like $790,000 a year. And there were like 3 or 4 people in that city government who were getting ridiculous salaries for what they were doing. And they'd been building this up over 4 or 5 years because Bell didn't have anybody covering it. Luckily, the LA Times, found out about it and did a great story on it. But how many Bells are out there? How many city councils and mayor's offices and police departments and are just doing things that we don't know about because we don't have anybody covering them or digging into public records. So, I mean, I think obviously the need for it is pretty, that to me is always the problem. And there's evidence out there. I think Pew did something not that long ago about, was it Pew? Somebody did a study about how much more corruption, so I can't remember exactly. I'm not going to try to characterize it because I can't quite remember what it said. But basically, it showed a connection to a lack of media to increased corruption in a lot of communities. So I mean, I think that's obviously why we're needed. We have to do things differently. But when I was at Digital First Media, I remember I would go to all these small papers that we had and ask them when the last time they filed a Freedom of Information Act request. And a lot of them were like, we just don't have the people to go through those anymore. And it was heartbreaking. And I would just tell them, look, the company will send you $1,000. Just do 5 or 6 of them anyway. If nothing, even if you can't look at them, at least remind them that you can file FOIA requests so that they think you might be looking. I guess that's not the best answer, but don't just stop doing FOIA requests. Don't stop, because the truth is, if they'd filed them and gotten the information, somebody would have found the time to look at them. That's just how reporters operate. They're not really going to let that stuff sit there and not get looked at. So, but it's kind of frightening when people are just not even doing public records requests anymore. They're just really important in this country. I mean, the local journalism has always had, I think, more of a tradition than in a lot of other countries, partially because of the scale of the country, just partially because of the history of media, but they're crucial. And that's why we fight so hard at night to figure out ways to get them sustainable. In terms of how they're going to be sustainable, there's lots of different answers to that. It depends on the publication and all that.
Bryce Schwell, let's go to you.
So I wanted to ask a question that was relating to what Adiz brought up a little bit ago, and it's relating to how national news outlets are typically it can be inadequate in their reporting or lackluster in their reporting or can be lazy sometimes. And I wanted to ask, in your opinion, do you think that's because of the 24-hour news cycle that's been the mainstream for national media outlets for like the past 10, 20 years? And getting away from that, is there any sort of viability for them going back to how things were maybe 40 or 50 years ago, or would there be any profitability in doing that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're going to have to rethink. I don't know that they're going to go back to 10 years ago. They do all that. The ratings aren't the revenue is not strong enough anymore, I think, to do 24 hours of original programming, for example. They're not going to just put one show on after another. Part of the reason they do the sessions where people scream at each other is it's cheap. You pay people some kind of retainer for the year, you put them on 5 times a month. The average segment cost is tiny compared to having some feet out in the street somewhere doing a story. So I don't think economically you can make a case against the screaming thing, because it works financially. So the key is will things change where will there be new partnerships in cable TV? Might a Fox or an MSNBC or a CNN partner with Netflix on like would somebody make a TV show about newsrooms? Would they run it on those stations at night or something? Would they find ways to work with people to plug some of those 24 hours at some cheaper rate? So, well, they repeat things again. They used to do that a lot. The early days of CNN, they used to basically, run the same stuff overnight. They would just repeat stuff, and that's cheaper. So, I mean, I think there's ways to do it, and ways that would be less damaging to the public debate, I think, if they would just find other ways to fill it. But I do worry that if they don't find those other ways, it's just a matter of time before you're back to, here are two people who hate each other. They're going to yell for the next 5 minutes. Enjoy, and it's just like, who enjoys this? What sadist enjoys watching this all day long? But the ratings, when they were doing that weren't, I mean, they've gone down now, but that might be more of a factor of Trump not being in the picture as much. But obviously a lot of people watched those screaming fits. I just think it was terrible for the country. And I think that you have these immensely powerful airwaves you could do so many things on, and this is what you choose. It's like going to a 5-star restaurant and saying, I'll have the burger and fries. At some point you have this great opportunity and you've kind of squandered it by just doing something so easy and cliche. So, so I don't know. I mean, I've done a lot of consulting for local television. I haven't worked in national news at all, other than like a 3-month gig at the Barcelona Olympics in '92 for NBC. But I was not making any strategic decisions. I was 25 and hauling coffee around Barcelona. So I don't really have a lot of experience on this, but certainly watching it as a consumer and looking at the economics of those publications. I mean, I think they're being prompted to think differently now because the ratings have gone. I'll put it this way. I think the ratings went up not too long after they started a lot of the screaming at each other stuff. And I think they might have thought that was the reason the ratings were higher. I think the ratings were higher because of Trump, to be honest. Like, he just drove audience. And I think when you separate, now Trump is, he's not out of the picture, don't get me wrong, but at least he's not the president at the moment. And yet the ratings have plummeted. So the question is, what was driving the ratings? Was it Donald Trump or was it the format? I think it was Trump. And so now they're seeing that you can put people screaming at each other all day long on the air. It's not helping ratings anymore. So is there another answer to how you solve that problem? And the answer is Donald Trump's going to run again, and they'll see their ratings go up. And I mean, I think he's going to run again. Who knows? But they may mistake that again for like a sign that this format works. I don't think the format necessarily works, but
yeah.
So I'm hoping they'll find something else that contributes more to the national dialogue than screamers.
Nancy, you want to ask a question?
Yeah, Tanos, I want to jump in because Jim, you touched on something early on, which was about trust in media. And it seems to me that we've spent a lot of time talking about how we satisfy the consumer as opposed to educate the consumer. Now, maybe I'm being old fashioned, but I recall when there was a higher goal in journalism. And that's that you didn't have to pander to or make didactic statements to bring in a public gathering. So, I mean, how do you resolve something like that? How can you do both at the same time? Yes, obviously, everybody has instant access and obviously a lot of false information, but is that not a responsibility of a very respectable media organization like yours?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I don't think you're pandering to them so much. I think when I say having a better relationship with the consumer, it's giving them things that are useful to them, right? It's not like one of the most if you ask me what the most underappreciated thing in news is, it's weather. Like, newspapers act like weather is just like this thing stupid people care about, right? But I mean, if you can answer the question of, do I need to pick an umbrella up in the morning? And you can answer the question of, why is there a backup on 495? Those are important questions to answer for people. If you can answer those basic questions for them, you can get them reading your publication. You can get them reading the story about the city council, but you got to get them there with something at first. And the basic human needs, if I want to get around, I want to know how I'm living my life in Houston or Dallas or Albuquerque or wherever. You got to answer those questions. And local newspapers really didn't do that. They didn't do traffic. They didn't do weather. They had a weather page, but they didn't do any of that real-time stuff that really affected people's lives. So when I say, I'm not saying pandering to, we pandered to them when we did all those stupid photo galleries. What I'm saying now is you need to answer questions they ask about their daily lives. They don't all have to be, here's a story about yes, we want to unveil corruption in City Hall, but we also want to tell people why that development that's been sitting there for a year untouched is still untouched. Answer the questions that they have when they walk around their own city. So it's definitely not pandering to them. It's responding to them. And we, in the newspaper industry, I would argue for a long time, didn't care what they thought. We didn't care about that building they walked by every day. We wanted to tell them about some other thing that we thought was important, and there has to be a mix of those two things. There's always going to be broccoli on the journalism plate. There's always going to be stuff that we need to tell them that they didn't think to ask, but we had a lot of broccoli for a while and not a lot of chips.
Yeah.
And I think, some of this is you got to give people things that are useful to them to get them in the door, because they have a lot of places they can go to get news. I know it sounds odd to say in a time in which local journalism struggling. What I mean by that is they don't have to go to any local news source. You still have to earn your way onto the list of sites they go to. It's easy for somebody to say, I'm just going to go to CNN and the Washington Post and Vox every day and not read anything local. So you got to earn your way onto what for a lot of people is a somewhat short list. And the only way, and what is our advantage as a local site versus a national site? We are where our consumers are.
Yeah.
We can tell them about things that we know they care about. We can throw events that they can come to. So my point is not to pander to them at all. It's to actually just bring them into the mix.
Yeah.
It's not to write only the stories they want us to write. It's to sometimes answer questions that they have. And there's something called Harken. I don't know if any of your news organizations use it, but it's a very good tool that basically allows you to take questions from the audience. And then you'll be surprised how good the questions are. When we had the site, we had a site called The Incline in Pittsburgh as part of the company that I had. And we just put questions, and they would ask questions like, why is Pittsburgh the only Pittsburgh in the United States that has an H at the end? All of the other ones end in G. This one has an H. Why is that? And it seems like a stupid question. And then you start digging in on it, and it's a fascinating answer. And we wrote a whole story about why Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania has the only H at the end. And it was one of our most read stories. So but that was just because a reader asked a quirky Pittsburgh question that we had never thought to do a story on, because I don't think any of us even knew it was the only Pittsburgh in the United States with an H at the end. So, and if anybody's interested in the why, I'm happy to tell you, but it was.
Let's go to Grace. Grace.
Hi, I just had a follow-up question about something you talked about earlier. Do you think that AOL could have stayed relevant if they had a better digital team?
Yeah, they could have stayed relevant in a lot of ways. I mean, the first mistake that we made was that we got the broadband revolution totally wrong in terms of adoption, like how many people were going to be on high, how many people are going to be using dial-up, because AOL was basically a dial-up thing that, had a broadband solution, but it was a little kludgy. And I think the adoption that we projected for broadband at that point, we were off by a factor of 5. I mean, it moved so much faster than we moved to adapt to it. And so people got tired of dial up and a lot of people left, but we got caught in the same innovator's dilemma, pretty quickly, which is, well, wait a minute, AOL I wasn't there at the beginning, but AOL was originally successful because it produced something nobody else was doing. It came up with a whole bunch of cool features, like you got pictures, which is something that nobody even remembers anymore, probably. But it was kind of like Flickr before Flickr and Instagram before Instagram. It had AIM, instant messenger, which is now basically texting. I mean, it did all these things early, but it started getting into this trap of, we don't want to lose people. Dial up is where we make our money. We don't want to, if we move people to broadband, we don't get the, because what AOL broadband was, you could use AOL, but you didn't have to pay for access. And you got some provider to provide the high speed connection, and then you just used AOL on top of that. Well, you didn't have to pay much for that. When we were your connector, you had to pay a lot of money. So we didn't want to lose people to broadband because it chipped away at the business. But we just did the same thing. We just did the same thing that people had done 10 years earlier that we had taken advantage of. It was slow moving. We didn't move. We got burned, and the thing, it's still around, which is amazing to me. But it's kind of dead as a brand now. But yeah, it could have been. If it had moved to broadband aggressively and really announced the fact that a lot of the tools that exist now were on AOL in the 90s that are so popular, then I think it could have been a thing. But what killed it was the merger, the Time Warner merger.
Yeah, absolutely.
To be honest, partially because they just never paid any attention to how those cultures were going to integrate, and the answer was not at all.
Exactly.
They hated each other from day one, and we never recovered from that. But I think in general, it was already a lot of signs of trouble in the air because of the lack of broadband strategy that we had in 2000. When that was announced, 2000, I think, 99, maybe, I can't remember.
99.
Michelle?
So my question for you is kind of about like what motivates you as a journalist, as someone in the journalism industry. You talked about how the business model is changing, and what's something that just drives you and that us as prospective journalists should be fueling us going into this industry.
Always driven me is I've always had such a passion for journalism, and the idea that there are cities and huge chunks of the country that might not have access to any of it. I find it terrifying because bad things happen when there's not somebody on the watch. So I mean, I worked at the Post, and it was very much there was a lot of national. It was kind of a national site even back then, and that's the only job I've ever had that really wasn't a local job, because local is really where my passion is. I ironically got into this business. I saw all the President's Men when I was 9, I think. And I would remember thinking like, I thought Ben Bradley was much, much cooler than Darth Vader personally. I just thought he had the coolest job in the world to be able to like bring down a president who was breaking the law. So I got into it for that reason. And I still am motivated by that. I'm like a lot of journalists. I like to see the bad guy get their comeuppance. And I just worry that there's a lot more bad guys and a lot less comeuppance if we don't have local journalists tracking what's going on. So that's what keeps me going. That's why this job was so fascinating when I took it, because you have an awful lot of money every year that you can devote toward things you think can preserve local journalism. If this job had been try to do the same thing for national journalism, I'm just not sure I would have been interested in it, because I just don't have that kind of passion at the national level. What I care about is making sure that the LA Times and the San Jose Mercury News and the Wisconsin State Journal are around in 10 years. And there's a whole bunch of startups outside of that. And if those aren't around, that they're replaced by the Capital Bs and the URL Medias and Texas Tribunes of the world. So we're really trying to fund 3 different levels of the journalistic ecosystem here. One is we focus a lot on trying to find legacy publishers who really want to change, not the ones who don't want to change. If you're still talking to me in 2022 about how you think print's going to be around for 20 years, then we're probably not going to be the person you want to work with. Economically, that's just not going to be viable at some point, and it's not going to be 20 years. The second level we try to work with is digital startups, like people who don't have any legacy publication who are trying to make their way in digital. And the third is, and this is one that we're going to put more effort on, is to really focus on the entrepreneurial sector. Like, how do we create the conditions for more people who want to get into journalism but don't know how to start? How do we give them the tools to launch? Because one of the real challenges I have figured out pretty quickly in this job is that there are a lot of people who want to be part of this battle, but they know that starting a news organization is not as simple as paying $39 a year for a WordPress site and writing stories. You have to do an awful lot of things to be a viable news organization beyond taxes and incorporation and payroll. You got to have insurance. You got to have lawyers who can help you out if you get yourself in trouble. And one of the things we're focusing on is the ecosystem of journalism. Right now, we fund the Reporters Committee for the Free Press Pro Bono Legal Network, where sites can go get free counsel from Davis Wright Tremaine or the Microsoft General Counsel's Office. They're a partner in this. And we're trying to create more of those things so that an entrepreneur who wants to get started now knows that there are services that can do most of the things that you need to do to get a site up and running, that you don't have to figure it all out on your own. We're going to leave the good journalism to you. We'll help you figure out the representation, the insurance, the back office stuff, the content management system. So those are the 3 sectors we focus on: is entrepreneurs, startups, and legacy.
Because we are running out of time and we still have some limited time, before we go to Marlo, I would like to ask you, Jim, very quickly, if you think that the future for media organizations is the non-profit model or the for-profit
I think it's
model. Both.
Yeah. I'm not in the camp that the only future is nonprofit. I mean, there's organizations out there making money now. And I think I'll keep the answer short because I know we're running out of time. The complaint people have about for-profit media is that it's hard to make journalism scale, and nonprofit, the problem is for-profits don't scale easily either. Every time you want to start nonprofits don't. Every time you want to start a nonprofit, you got to find somebody to fund it. It's not like there's an off-the-shelf nonprofit book where somebody just start, you got to find funders. You got to get those funders to continue to fund you if you can't sustain yourself. The beautiful thing about a for-profit model, if it works, is it throws off cash that allows you to expand into other places without having to find additional funders. So I'm a believer that there's both. I think the full-on state level investigative sites you see out there, like the ones in West Virginia, and I think those are going to be largely nonprofits because they don't publish enough to generate the kind of audience that's going to be supported by a lot of your other traditional models. But I do think, like, if you look at Axios is in 14 cities right now, trying to get to 100. That's a for-profit business, and I think they're already profitable on the local side. So I think it's both. I think you just have to be smart at the top, because the only thing I'd say is once you make that decision, it's hard to change it. So you can change it, but it's a lot of work to change either direction. So, but I think there'll be both. I think there has to be both.
Yeah. Marlo?
Hi, so I'm a journalism student at the University of Florida, and I've kind of specialized in environmental journalism. But one of the other things that really interests me is data reporting. And I've been lucky enough to kind of take a couple of classes in that and get my feet wet. And we've seen a lot of really cool, data-based models and other data reporting-based, news, whether it relates to, the Ukraine conflict right now or other things put out by the Washington Post team, a lot of these large-scale digital teams. But I'm wondering where you think data reporting can aid local news and what gaps it can fill.
Yes, I would say, please go into data journalism. We need more people doing it. It's such a crucial part of the future, and there's not enough people doing it yet. And I hired a guy named Adrian Halavati in like 2008 at the Washington Post, who was one of the first real, like, inside the newsroom data developers. And he was so good. And he just changed how we thought about data at the Post. And we were doing some national, some local stuff, and I thought that was the beginning of the revolution. And yes, there's a lot more of it now than there was in 2008, but a lot of people still don't have any access to data reporting. And the beauty of data reporting is it's not just something you can put in front of your audience to have them consume. There's so many stories hiding in any data set you pull. If you really know how to look at a data set, there's 10 stories hiding in any good data set. And so for story generation, it's there. I mean, you go back to, the example I always use is 2010 or something, The Guardian got like 1.2 million MP expense reports because there was a bunch of MP cheating on expense reports in the UK, and they didn't have the ability to go through them. So they put them all on the web and basically said, hey, public, all go look at these and find if there's stuff in here you think you see that's shady, let us know. And the Guardian got a whole bunch of tips of all this funky stuff that was going on in these expense reports, wrote a whole series of stories about it. Now you can, in 5 years, you might be able to do that with AI. But the point is like, when you get data, there are stories behind it, but so many places are not doing those data sets. I'd urge you to look at, have you seen Crosstown yet? It's kind of interesting. Crosstown, it's in LA. It's run out of USC, and it's got really interesting data. They're starting to do all these data sets around LA. And they just did a pilot program where they partnered with the Times-Picayune in New Orleans to do a New Orleans version, the Baton Rouge paper to do one in there, and then a third one where I cannot remember where it is. But it's probably on their site. But they're doing these full-on data sets that they're making available basically to any other journalist in town who want to use it. And I think there's some future in that. Okay, fine. Everybody won't have a data journalist. But what if every town has a crosstown that basically says, here's all the local data we have. Go find stories in there. Like, I think that would be great. So I think data's got to be a huge part of this, but we need people who want to do the work. And the truth of the matter is, the reason it's always been hard to find data journalists in journalism is we don't pay what the tech industry pays. And so you have people who think they want to do this journalism thing, and they do it for 2 years, and then they get offered double their salary to go work at Google. And, and it's hard to keep them. So that's been one of the challenges, but I hope you decide to go into it, because it's a really, really necessary part of the system that has not grown as quickly as I think it should have.
And one last question, because we have still 3 minutes before our next program is starting. And Jim, we really appreciate all of the time that you've been sharing with us. Let's go to Michelle. Michelle, if you can unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? I think my audio cut out.
Yes, I'm saying if you would like to ask any follow-up question, or otherwise we will go to Alenis.
Yeah, no follow-up questions. I've really enjoyed our
Please,
conversation.
Alenis.
Okay, so my question is just, how does your role at the Knight Foundation kind of differ from what you've done before with like Washington Post, AOL, and things like that?
Completely in every way. It's different. It's my first nonprofit job. It's my first philanthropic job. And, you know, I like to think that my jokes are funny, but now I don't know because everybody laughs at everything I say because I have money to give away. So that's a little bit of a shift and I don't necessarily enjoy it. But, you know, it's a different relationship you have. You have to be very careful what you say when you're talking to people who are coming to you to make a grant proposal, because if you say something like, I really like this idea, they're already thinking about how much money you're going to get. And it's like, no, we can't fund everything we like. There's still a lot of hurdles to get past after we like it. And then, so it's very different in that regard. It's very much more, you have to be more guarded. You have to be more cautious about how you talk. You have to be careful not to set expectations. And so that's been a shift for me because I'm more of a like stream of, you probably noticed in the last hour, stream of consciousness, ranter, raver type. And so here you have to be a lot more guarded and thoughtful, but so it's a very different job. And I think the pace of it is not much different because we run pretty aggressive here. I mean, we're working long hours every day, which I don't mind at all, but it's but the difference is I think you don't have any daily responsibility for a newsroom. You're not getting the 3 a.m. call that the Russians have just gone into the Ukraine. And I think for other people, they'd say that sounds terrible. Like that's what motivates them. I did it for 25 years and I loved it, but I'm not feeling like at 54, I need any more 3 a.m. phone calls to wake up and deal with the breaking news story. So for me, this is a perfect opportunity to apply what I've learned over almost 30 years of doing, more than 30 years of doing journalism, but almost 30 doing digital, and to try to help this local news ecosystem that I love.
We want to thank you, Jim, and please let us know if we can share your email address with our guests.
Yeah, you can share the email.
Follow up
Yep.
with any questions.
Brady@kf.org. Yeah, feel free to send it out.
And we really appreciate your time. Nancy, you would like to say something before we conclude? We don't hear you.
Talking to me?
We don't hear Nancy.
Okay.
Yeah.
I knew Joan Challenor well when she was representing, well, it was a different element that she was running at that point and involved in, but she had a very classical idea of journalism and what the responsibilities were. Now, it seems to me today, it's kind of turned upside down. So, you know, when you talk about the young journalists, the problem is a lot of them don't have the scaffolding that they had then. And how would you suggest that they go about trying to find that kind of support system or ecosystem, as you called it?
Yeah. And by the way, I hate the term ecosystem. I just can't come up with a better one. And so it's so overused, but if anybody has an idea. No, I think, I find mentors. I mean, that's certainly a big part of it. I mean, you're right, because back in the day where somebody got to the Washington Post, they probably had 6 stops along the way in Dubuque and you know, Wheaton, Illinois. And like by the time they got there, they'd kind of worked up the ladder and learned a lot along the way. In a lot of cases now, their first job is at a startup where they're surrounded by people who are also in their 20s and they don't really have the mentors to go to learn the ropes. So I certainly would say find somebody you trust and someone you really feel comfortable with. I think mentors are really more important now than they've ever been because the structures of the newsrooms don't lend themselves to that kind of on-the-job learning. So I know you have another program, so I don't want to keep you going.
Thank you so much, Jim. We see you all in the next session. We are going to discuss the consequences of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And Jim, we have like weekly programs, 2-3 programs every week. So we appreciate your time, and we certainly, hopefully, we will have another program where we can have you as a guest speaker with us again, because we still have like a lot of questions, and I'm sure that many of our guests here will follow up with you.
Sounds good.
Thank you
Thanks
for
all
your
for your time
time.
and attention.
Thank you very
Take
much,
care.
Jim.
Thank you.
Yeah, bye-bye.